Nathan Harper had always believed that after enough hard work and sacrifice, a man should be allowed a space of his own. A space to breathe without being watched, judged, or corrected. He had spent 3 decades climbing out of a Rust Belt town in Pennsylvania, building a modestly successful contracting business, raising a daughter who turned out sharper than either of her parents, and enduring the slow erosion of his back, his patience, and his optimism through years of physical labor and civic headaches. Retirement wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even something he particularly desired. But when the market tipped in his favor and an aging lakeside property on the outskirts of Colorado went up for sale, tucked just past a ridge where the main development ended, Nathan and his wife Melissa took it as a sign. Not just a chance to start over, but a chance to finally live in a place not yet poisoned by committees and codes and social games played in driveways and parking lots. The house itself wasn't anything flashy, a single-story ranch with slightly warped siding, a long gravel driveway, and a backyard that sloped down toward a tree-lined lake. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in privacy. It sat outside the boundaries of the neighborhood development that sprawled uphill, just far enough to be exempt from the rules and restrictions that had once nearly driven Nathan mad back in their old suburban zip code. No dues, no mandatory meetings, no fines for the color of your mailbox or the orientation of your patio furniture. Just sky, trees, water, and silence. Melissa had looked at the real estate flyer and, for the first time in a long time, said, "I think we could breathe here." They moved in early spring, just as the snow started its annual retreat. Nathan put his energy into small practical upgrades, fixing the porch railings, resealing the deck, laying out stones around the fire pit. Melissa, with her natural instinct for comfort, created a space that felt both lived-in and intentional. Vintage iron frame loungers along the back lawn, wildflowers planted in mismatched ceramic pots, and a soft string of Edison lights that hung above the yard like a canopy of warm stars. It wasn't pristine, but it was beautiful. It was theirs. It was the kind of place you could fall asleep with a book on your chest and wake up to the sound of birds instead of car alarms. Their daughter, Anna, had even joked on a video call, "You guys are like fully entering your peaceful cottagecore era." But peace, Nathan had come to understand, was not a default state of the world. It had to be fought for, and sometimes it had to be defended. The first hint that something was off came not with a confrontation, but a pie. A cherry lattice, too perfect to have been store-bought, too symmetrical to be casual. The woman who brought it, Karen Miller, as she introduced herself, stood at their door with the practiced brightness of someone who had done this many times before. Her white blouse was stiff with starch, her lips drawn into a precise pink line that resembled a smile but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a little welcome," she said, holding the pie with both hands, as though offering a ceremonial object. "It's a tight-knit area. We like to look out for each other." Nathan didn't flinch. He had seen that tone before, the kind that dressed itself in warmth but came layered with surveillance. Still, he invited her in, out of politeness if nothing else. Karen declined. She explained, a lot to do that afternoon. She pointed vaguely toward the hill, where the tidy homes of the upper development stood in rows like clipped hedges. "We keep things in order up there," she said, eyes flicking toward the Harper backyard. "That's what keeps this place desirable. You'll see." Melissa accepted the pie with a smile, thanked her, and closed the door the moment Karen turned her back. She set the dish on the kitchen counter and walked away without another word. Nathan, already pulling weeds along the front fence, saw the way Karen paused at the mailbox before heading back up the road, saw her glance over her shoulder, not at him, but at the side yard where Melissa had hung an old woven hammock between 2 trees. It wasn't new, but it had character, the kind of imperfection that made things feel human. By the following morning, 3 bright orange landscaping flags had appeared at the edge of their yard, evenly spaced, driven into the soil with military precision. Each one bore the words, "Unverified lot line." Nathan, still in his boots from working outside, crouched to inspect them, then pulled them out without a word. He wasn't a man who overreacted to nonsense. But something about the flags, it wasn't the message, it was the audacity. That someone thought they could dictate what existed on his land without speaking, without proof, without jurisdiction. Melissa took the pie and tossed it in the bin. Over the next few days, things shifted subtly. Their grocery deliveries were delayed. A utility crew appeared unannounced to inspect a gas line report that didn't exist. Nathan's lumber shipment from a local supply company was misrouted, then rerouted again. Every time he made a call, the answer was a vague, apologetic shrug. It must have been an internal error, or our system says you're in the HOA zone, sir. He had to repeat, again and again, that he was not. But the mistakes kept piling up. The feeling of being encircled slowly by something bureaucratic and deliberate began to erode the joy they had felt in the first weeks. Melissa, not prone to paranoia, began keeping a list: timestamps, delivery issues, unscheduled visits. She took photos, not out of fear but out of principle. Nathan didn't ask her to. She just started doing it. She had lived in suburbia long enough to know what passive aggression looked like when it dressed itself as a neighborhood standard. Then came the first anonymous letter. No envelope, just a folded sheet of printer paper, wedged into their front door frame during the night. No handwriting, just typewritten text in bold Arial. Your property is inconsistent with the visual standards of our community. Please remove the furniture from your lawn or risk escalation. It wasn't signed. There was no contact number, just that phrase, risk escalation. Nathan read it, handed it to Melissa, and said nothing. She folded it, added it to the manila envelope she'd begun keeping in the desk drawer, and resumed her coffee. There were no outbursts, no screaming matches across the yard, no police calls. Not yet. But Nathan felt the shift in atmosphere like a barometric drop before a storm. Neighbors who had waved politely now avoided eye contact. A couple walking their dog crossed to the other side of the street without explanation. One afternoon he caught a man he didn't recognize standing across from their property, hands in his pockets, just staring not at the house, but at the yard, at the loungers, at the fire pit. Nathan stepped outside. The man left. When he mentioned it later, Melissa said quietly, "They want us to feel unwelcome without ever saying the words." He nodded. That's how it starts. It was a truth as old as any conflict: make someone feel out of place long enough, and eventually they'll move on, just to get peace. But the Harpers had come here for peace, and they had no intention of giving it up. Not for a pie, not for flags, and certainly not for Karen Miller. It began, as many serious conflicts do, not with a loud incident, but with a calculated violation dressed in procedural ambiguity. One Wednesday morning, Melissa opened the front door to find two men standing on the edge of their property, wearing matching reflective vests, holding clipboards, and staring down the contour of the lawn as if surveying a construction site. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They didn't even glance toward the house. Melissa watched from the porch for a moment before calling out, asking if they needed something. The taller of the two glanced up, smiled politely in that hollow, practiced way, and said they were responding to a concern submitted by the Neighborhood Review Committee regarding improper surface grading and potential runoff. Melissa stood still, trying to understand the language, the bureaucratic veneer over something that clearly wasn't about water flow. She told them this wasn't part of any enforced zone, that their property wasn't under committee jurisdiction, but they simply nodded, took a few more notes, and left without clarification, retreating to an unmarked pickup truck parked 2 houses down. Nathan arrived home just as they were driving off and found Melissa standing beside a shallow indentation in the grass, arms folded, face tight. She explained what had happened, handed him the pamphlet the men had left, a half-page document printed on thick paper stock with vague language about voluntary compliance and residential aesthetics and unified ground appearance. There was no official seal, no contact name, and no signature. Nathan read it, then crumpled it in his fist without ceremony. "It's just a push," he muttered. They're trying to find the line. Melissa didn't argue. Instead, she suggested they install a visible property marker, a low decorative fence to line the lawn and clearly delineate their space from the easement. Not a confrontation, just a statement. A reminder. Nathan agreed, and by the end of the weekend, the border was set. Clean wooden slats with subtle solar lights along the perimeter, nothing extravagant, but enough to say, this is ours and no further. It was practical, measured, even tasteful. 3 days later, the fence was tagged. It wasn't graffiti in the conventional sense. No crude language or symbols. Just one word, written neatly across the middle slat in black permanent marker, integrate. Melissa found it early in the morning, before the sun had even fully broken the horizon. She didn't scream or panic. She simply stared at it, then turned and went inside. She told Nathan over breakfast, and he followed her out in silence. They stood there for a long time, not because they didn't know what it meant, but because they did. It was a demand, a warning disguised as a principle. Later that same day, while Nathan was away picking up lumber, Melissa received a visit. Karen, wearing an ash blue sweater set and that same tight smile, walked up the path without calling ahead, as if they were close friends with unspoken permissions. Melissa met her halfway, arms crossed. Karen didn't acknowledge the fence or the message written across it. Instead, she launched into a seemingly benign conversation about community spirit and how sometimes it's hard for new homeowners to understand the tone of the neighborhood. She spoke in euphemisms and suggestions, referring to shared standards and the responsibility to preserve visual cohesion. She never accused, never commanded, just dropped layer upon layer of implication like silk scarves hiding something sharp underneath. Melissa listened with the cool expression of someone who had long ago learned that silence in the face of subtle provocation often says more than argument. Finally, Karen, as if delivering a compliment, said, "You know, it would be so easy to become a part of the group. A few small adjustments, a willingness to participate, that's all it takes to stop feeling outside." Melissa smiled for the first time during the conversation, but it was not a warm expression. "We're not here to fit into anyone's grid," she said. "We're here to live." Karen's lips twitched, but she said nothing. She turned and walked back toward the street, pausing only once to glance at the fence again. The message had already been sanded down, but Nathan had etched a small brass plate into the middle board that morning. It read simply, "Private property, respect required." The Escalation, however, didn't wait for their next move. On Sunday, they invited 2 friends over for an outdoor lunch, a casual afternoon gathering, just 4 adults sitting in the yard, grilling food, sipping drinks, enjoying the breeze and the view of the lake. The loungers were pulled closer together. A folding table was set with fresh lemonade, paper plates, and a bowl of grilled vegetables. Music played softly from a speaker tucked into the porch corner, barely loud enough to hear over the wind. No shouting, no mess, no crowds. But just after 3 p.m., a sheriff's cruiser pulled into their driveway. Nathan stepped forward as the officer, a middle-aged man with an apologetic expression, approached. He removed his sunglasses and said there had been a call reporting unpermitted construction and obstruction of public view. Nathan, confused, gestured toward the yard, then asked what exactly was being referred to. The officer looked at the loungers, the table, and then back at his notes, clearly uncomfortable. Melissa joined them, calm but firm. "This is our yard. Those are our chairs. What exactly is obstructed?" The officer didn't have a good answer. He admitted that the report came from someone on the neighborhood liaison board who claimed a large, unauthorized structure was being erected. "It's obviously not," he added quickly, sensing the tension. "But I'm obligated to respond. May I ask if this is a recurring setup?" Nathan took a long breath before responding. "They're chairs. Sometimes we sit in them. Sometimes we don't. You tell me if that's illegal." The officer, to his credit, didn't press. He made a note that the call had no substance, advised them to keep documentation of any further incidents, and left with a quick nod of apology. Their guests remained polite but visibly uncomfortable for the rest of the afternoon. When they left, one of them, a friend of Nathan's from his contracting days, said quietly, "You're going to have to crush this, Nate. People like that don't stop because you ignore them." By nightfall, Nathan and Melissa had decided they couldn't rely on hope or reason alone. They would not strike back, not in kind, but they would prepare. Melissa began keeping a log not just of events, but of behaviors: who passed by their property and when, which cars lingered, who stared too long. Nathan called a local land use attorney not to sue, not yet, but to better understand the limits of what they could do and what others couldn't. They weren't planning to turn this into a spectacle. They simply refused to be pushed into submission through covert aggression and procedural bullying. And yet, just 2 mornings later, a certified letter arrived in their mailbox, stamped with official language but bearing no governmental seal. It was from the so-called Residential Standards Enforcement Group, stating that the Harpers had failed to comply with Section 4, Unified Visual Policy, and that non-compliance could lead to civil escalations. The letter, like the pamphlets before it, was unsigned, lacking return address or verification. It was essentially a threat on letterhead. Nathan showed it to the attorney, who confirmed what they already suspected: no such enforcement entity had authority over their parcel of land. They were outside the formal development, exempt from any neighborhood covenants, untouched by the voting bloc that now seemed intent on absorbing their home into its ideological territory. But that didn't mean the pressure would stop. The lawyer offered sound advice: document, stay calm, and be prepared for escalation tactics that wouldn't be carried out officially but socially. It wasn't about the chairs. It wasn't even about the yard. It was about power, about one woman's obsessive need to extend her reach just a few feet further, and about the quiet network that enabled her, not because they believed in her mission, but because they feared the discomfort of opposing her. Nathan folded the letter, placed it beside the others, and looked out at the still, empty yard. The loungers remained untouched, exactly as they had been. The grass bent softly in the wind. The lake shimmered like nothing had changed, but something had, and the next move he knew would not be theirs. If Nathan had any lingering hope that the situation might fade on its own, it evaporated in the days that followed. What had once felt like an uncomfortable but containable nuisance now began to shape itself into a full-fledged strategy of pressure. There were no dramatic confrontations, no one pounding on the door or shouting across fences. Instead, it came in quiet accumulations, the kind that made each day feel slightly off balance, until even the act of drinking coffee on the back porch felt like an act of defiance. The loungers remained in place, undisturbed in the literal sense, but something about their continued presence had become symbolic, almost ideological, as though, by refusing to move them, the Harpers were making a political statement in a war they had never volunteered to join. It started with trash collection. On Monday morning, Nathan wheeled their bin out as usual to the edge of the driveway. By afternoon, he found it untouched, still full, while the neighbors' bins had all been emptied. At first, he assumed it was a mistake, that perhaps he'd put it out too late, or that the collector had simply missed it. But when the same thing happened the following week, and again the week after that, he decided to make a call. The waste management company was polite but confused. According to their route report, the bin had been collected each time. Nathan insisted it hadn't. They sent someone out to investigate and returned with an answer that made little sense. The collection crew claimed the bin was not visible at curbside. Nathan didn't argue. He simply installed a motion-activated camera near the driveway. The footage was clear. At 6:08 a.m., 2 men in uniforms drove up in a white truck. They stopped at the Harpers' house, looked directly at the bin, then drove off. No attempt was made to lift or empty it. Nathan saved the clip and sent it to the company. He received a half-hearted apology and the promise of correction, but in his gut he knew the issue hadn't been administrative. Someone had intervened. Whether it was Karen or someone operating on her behalf, He couldn't say for certain. But the precision of the behavior, visible, deniable, and just irritating enough to be disruptive, was too aligned with the pattern that had been building for weeks. Melissa, meanwhile, had her own encounter. While shopping at a local hardware store, she overheard two women talking in the paint aisle. They were discussing a problem couple on Lakeside Road, people who had refused to contribute and were acting like they were better than everyone else. One of them described the loungers. The other mentioned the wife with the attitude. Melissa stood in the next aisle, holding a set of gardening gloves, her heart beating faster, not because of the words themselves she had heard worse, but because of the casualness of it. The way these strangers spoke, as if repeating common knowledge, as if her life and character had become a kind of community shorthand for entitlement. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. It was enough to know the campaign had gone beyond direct action. Their names, at least, their story was now in circulation. Then came the sign. It appeared overnight, mounted neatly on a wooden stake, driven into the edge of the Harpers' front lawn just beyond the mailbox. In clean, laminated plastic letters it read, Community Standard Encouraged Area. Please observe unified aesthetic practices. There was no logo, no contact name, and no identification of authority, just the language of assumed compliance. Melissa saw it first when she went out to check the mail. She didn't touch it. She stood there for several minutes, then walked back inside and printed a photo of it. Nathan came home half an hour later, read the sign, said nothing, and went to the garage. 10 minutes later, he returned with a crowbar, removed the stake with slow, deliberate pressure, and tossed the entire assembly into the trunk of his truck. That evening, he drove it to a dumpster at a shopping center 2 towns away. They knew what they were dealing with now. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a neighborly disagreement. It was a campaign of attrition. That weekend, Nathan received a letter from a property services company he'd never heard of. It stated that a routine visual inspection had noted non-compliant outdoor fixtures that could potentially devalue surrounding lots. The language was legalistic, full of passive constructions and speculative warnings. Nathan handed it to their attorney, who confirmed that the company had no jurisdiction, no right to inspect their property, and no legal grounds to contact them at all. He advised ignoring it, but added, with some reluctance, that it might be time to begin documenting all mail and communication for potential legal action. The pattern, he said, was becoming actionable. Melissa started noticing more subtle changes. Packages they hadn't ordered began arriving, nothing alarming, but odd items, a bulk shipment of pine bark mulch, a box of fluorescent garden stakes, even a set of solar-powered owl decoys, each addressed correctly to Nathan or Melissa, but none from sources they recognized. They weren't being charged. The shipments were prepaid. When they contacted the retailers, the orders traced back to anonymous online accounts. It was a classic tactic: create disruption through false fulfillment, waste time, force engagement, chip away at routine. Meanwhile, neighbors who had once nodded in passing now averted their eyes entirely. The couple 2 doors down, who had exchanged polite conversation just a few weeks earlier, now pulled into their garage with deliberate speed, closing the door before even exiting the vehicle. A sense of quarantine settled over the house, not official, not spoken, but undeniably present. Then came the call to their daughter. Anna was in college 3 states away. Independent, smart, and capable. She'd been following the events mostly through texts and occasional video calls. But one afternoon she phoned Nathan, her voice tight, asking why someone had contacted her student housing office, asking to verify her home address for residency confirmation. Nathan froze. No one should have been contacting her school for any reason. Anna had received an email, 2 unsigned, from a generic Gmail address, claiming to be working with the local community oversight panel and requesting confirmation of her family's address for a demographic property assessment. She had forwarded the message. Nathan read it, then printed it and added it to their growing file. It was the moment the line had officially been crossed. Melissa contacted their attorney and began the process of issuing a formal cease and desist letter, not to Karen directly because nothing had come directly from her, but to the unnamed group acting under the identity of the Community Oversight Initiative, a fictional entity that had no legal standing. The letter was concise, drafted in formal legal language, and posted publicly on a community bulletin board downtown where Melissa knew it would be seen. They didn't hear anything for 2 days. Then, one morning just after dawn, they woke to find a professionally printed brochure tucked into their screen door. It was titled, "Why Unity Matters, the Case for Community Standards." Inside, it contained generic stock photos of suburban homes with matching porches, fences, and chairs, smiling couples with matching mugs, in long paragraphs about the psychological benefits of visual harmony. On the back page, a quote attributed to no one read. "What resists integration weakens collective peace." Nathan didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was steady, but his expression had hardened. "They've decided we're the cancer," he said. "And they think if they push long enough, we'll either cut ourselves out or rot." Melissa nodded, her hand still holding the brochure. "They think we're still weighing whether to fight." "We're not," he said, walking toward the office. "Now we're deciding how." The morning that marked the shift from tension to confrontation began not with a knock at the door or a letter in the mailbox, but with a quiet, sharp noise, something thin and deliberate, like the soft clack of plastic against wood. Nathan had risen early, as he often did, intending to take advantage of the morning calm to trim the overgrown hedge along the west side of the property. But as he stepped out with his gloves and trimmer in hand, he stopped cold at the sight of 5 new markers, each bright white with reflective tips, planted in a perfect arc along the curve of their lawn. These weren't flimsy garden flags or homemade signs, they looked official. Too official. Uniform in height, evenly spaced, with each one bearing a small label laminated in plastic that read, "Visual Review Candidate, Property Zone Evaluation Pending." Nathan stood over them, trying to absorb the language, trying to make sense of the terminology, and then realized that was the point. There was no meaning. The language had been engineered to sound legitimate enough to make him hesitate, to make others believe some external authority was in play. It was another move in the same quiet war: create confusion, introduce doubt, chip away at confidence with just enough realism to complicate a response. He didn't remove them, not right away. He called Melissa, and together they photographed each one, noting their placement and label, adding it to the binder they had begun keeping with every letter, printout, and screenshot since the harassment began. That same day, their attorney, a meticulous woman named Jacobs, called with an update. After several back-and-forth communications with local enforcement and zoning offices, she had received written confirmation that no regulatory body, municipal or private, had any claim over the Harpers' property. The home, the lawn, the land all outside the formal subdivision jurisdiction. It should have been a relief. But Nathan didn't exhale. He asked what options existed if the campaign continued. Jacobs was blunt: if they're smart, they won't leave fingerprints. But what they're doing now already qualifies as a coordinated campaign to interfere with your peaceful use of property. If they escalate, if there's damage. If they try to involve law enforcement again under false pretenses, you'll have grounds for a civil harassment suit. But the key is patience. They're counting on you to overreact, to give them something visible, something that turns the story against you. You don't give it to them. You just build the record. That night, Melissa couldn't sleep. She lay awake next to Nathan, watching the ceiling fan spin slow circles, hearing the occasional crack of wood settling in the frame of the house. It wasn't fear. It was vigilance. The attention that had slowly become a fixture in their home. Even silence had taken on an edge. She got up at some point near midnight, poured herself a glass of water, and walked barefoot to the window overlooking the yard. And that's when she saw her. Karen stood at the edge of the street, her arms folded, not moving. She wasn't holding anything, not taking photos, not speaking, just watching. as if waiting for a curtain to lift or a spotlight to fall, as if waiting for the house itself to blink. Melissa didn't move. She didn't reach for her phone or turn on the porch light. She just stared back, invisible behind the glass, until Karen turned and walked back into the dark. The next day, the markers were gone. Not removed, replaced. 5 new ones, same format, but now labeled temporary incompatibility, scheduled for committee discussion. And then, the first letter with names. It arrived in a manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from their own city. Inside, a folded letterhead bore the title, Community Enrichment Coalition, Confidential Summary. It listed 9 properties, including theirs, with a column next to each marked status, review required. Melissa scanned the sheet, her hands cold. Next to their address, someone had handwritten in blue ink, consistently uncooperative. Refused alignment. Below that, photographic documentation available upon request. Nathan didn't speak for several moments after reading it. When he finally did, his voice was lower than usual, the tone measured, controlled. "They're documenting us," he said. "They've built a case file, and they want us to know it exists." It was at this moment they decided to bring in an outside observer. Not a friend, not a neighbor, a mediator. Jacobs referred them to a man named Warren Teller, a former city planner who had worked for years mediating disputes over land use and neighborhood development. He was semi-retired, sharp-eyed, and unassuming, the kind of man who dressed simply, listened quietly, and took notes by hand. He came to the house late in the afternoon, walked the property with Nathan, sat with Melissa at the kitchen table, and reviewed the binder they had compiled. After nearly 2 hours of calm, methodical review, he leaned back and said, "What you're facing is what I call soft pressure compliance. They're creating a scaffold of false formality around you using the appearance of governance without any actual power. Most people cave. You haven't." Nathan asked what came next. Teller nodded toward the binder. "You keep this, you build it, and when they make a mistake and you'll have it ready. But for now, I suggest we force a conversation." The meeting was scheduled on neutral ground, a community resource office near the town square. Karen arrived precisely on time, not alone, but with 2 others, a man in a slate gray blazer who introduced himself as coordinator of the Enrichment Coalition, and a woman with a clipboard who never gave her name. Melissa and Nathan sat opposite them, with Teller positioned squarely between, not as legal counsel, but as a documented third party. From the beginning, the meeting held a performative tension. Karen opened with carefully chosen phrases, all wrapped in civility and false concern, shared visual interests, the challenge of mixed regulation areas, a desire for neighborhood equilibrium. Nathan listened, arms folded, saying nothing. Melissa kept her eyes fixed on Karen the entire time, watching the way she gestured, the way she offered sympathy while implying guilt. When it was their turn, Teller took the lead. He presented their evidence, not all of it, just enough. The photos, the signs, the anonymous letters. He referenced zoning documents, formal city maps, and Jacobs' written confirmations. Karen's companions began to shift uncomfortably. The man in the blazer asked if this was being recorded. Teller answered that detailed notes were being kept and could be submitted as a public memorandum if necessary. The woman with the clipboard scribbled furiously, never lifting her head. Finally, Karen spoke again, and for the first time her voice cracked ever so slightly. "We're just trying to protect the spirit of the neighborhood. If everyone did what they wanted." Nathan cut in, calm and firm. "We are doing what we want, on our land, within the law, and you're not a governing body. You're a group with a clipboard." Karen's face twitched. "So this is war, then?" "No," Melissa said, evenly. "This is boundaries. You cross them." The meeting ended with no resolution, no apology, and no promise of peace. But something had shifted. The illusion of quiet authority had fractured. Karen had been forced to sit across from the people she'd tried to isolate and defend her actions in front of a stranger with a notepad. and she had not come out looking strong. 2 days later, the final marker disappeared from their yard. No note, no sign, just gone. But Nathan didn't see it as a retreat. He saw it as a pause, a recalibration, because people like Karen didn't vanish when exposed. They changed tactics. They grew quiet again. They waited for you to look away. And the Harpers, now fully awake to the scale of what they were facing, weren't planning to blink. The silence that followed the mediation was not a truce. It was the kind of stillness that carries weight, like the pause between two claps of thunder. Nathan and Melissa knew better than to assume the absence of overt action meant the end of hostility. In fact, it was the absence that unsettled them most. For nearly a week, no new markers appeared, no letters arrived, and no odd visits or unsolicited packages disrupted their routine. It was as if the house had become invisible again, or perhaps worse, forgotten. But beneath that illusion of calm, Nathan could feel the tension coil tighter, the way a rope does just before it snaps. When dealing with someone like Karen, he reasoned, overt confrontation was only one of many tools. She had tested pressure, tested exclusion, tested rumor and performance. Now she would pivot to institutional force, turn the very systems that were supposed to protect people into quiet weapons. It began with a letter, this time from the county permitting office. Official letterhead, digital signature, envelope postmarked through certified government channels. It stated that a complaint had been filed alleging that structural additions had been made to the Harper property without proper authorization, specifically referencing permanent outdoor installations. The language was dry, bureaucratic, and non-accusatory, but the implication was clear. They were being investigated. The loungers, the patio lights, even the decorative fence Melissa had installed months prior, all of it now under scrutiny. Nathan took the letter to Jacobs, who assured him it was standard protocol, that the complaint had triggered a procedural response, and that it would be simple to resolve if no violations were present. Still, it would require an on-site inspection from a county assessor. Melissa asked if the complaint was anonymous. Jacobs nodded. Always is, in cases like this. The assessor arrived 3 days later. He was young, polite, and clearly aware of the nature of the situation. It was not the first time he had been used as a pawn in neighborhood disputes, and while he couldn't say so directly, he made it known through his tone and body language that he found the task tedious. Still, he walked the perimeter, took photos, measured the distance from the house to the fence line, noted the type of fixtures installed in the yard, and politely reminded them that he was required to submit a report regardless of what he personally thought. Nathan thanked him. Melissa gave him a glass of water. He left with a quiet nod and no promises. The report came back neutral, no violations, no citations. But the visit alone had done its work. Neighbors who had previously ignored them now stared openly as they passed, whispering to each other on sidewalks and porches. The implication of an investigation was enough to alter perception. To people already primed by rumor, the presence of an official vehicle meant guilt, regardless of outcome. Karen struck next with timing so precise it could only have been intentional. At the next town forum, a monthly public meeting held at the local hall where residents could raise concerns, she submitted a formal complaint to the environmental subcommittee, accusing the Harpers of contributing to water pollution through unregulated drainage runoff. She brought photos of their backyard taken from a distance, likely from the upper trail behind the lake, and argued that their setup could potentially be contributing to sediment flow into the waterway. Nathan only learned about the complaint after the fact, when Jacobs forwarded a copy of the minutes. It wasn't about runoff. It was about stacking documentation, about creating a trail of paper that, taken together, might eventually look like a pattern. One complaint about furniture, one about property lines, one about water. None serious on their own, but enough of them, repeated often enough, layered with anonymous whispers and official forms, could plant the idea that the Harpers were somehow in the wrong. The next hit wasn't a letter or a meeting. It was physical. Nathan returned from the hardware store one afternoon to find the wooden fence along the eastern edge of their property had been vandalized, not destroyed, damaged. Several of the slats had been unscrewed, not broken, and rearranged in such a way that the straight line now bent inward toward their yard. From the street, it looked as though they had encroached on the communal trail easement that bordered their lot. A subtle optical lie, but one designed for exactly one audience, the passing observer who wouldn't question the shift, only register the impression. Melissa stood by the fence when he arrived, arms crossed, jaw locked in a way he hadn't seen in years. She didn't speak. Nathan examined the screws, noted that the tool marks were clean, likely done with an electric driver. Whoever had done it had taken their time and done it carefully. It was not vandalism born of anger. It was strategic. It was the quiet reshaping of a narrative. He fixed the fence that evening, documenting everything before and after. But something had changed between him and Melissa, something subtle but firm. They no longer debated whether the next move would come. They expected it. They prepared for it. The property, once their retreat, had become a front line. That weekend, while Melissa was away visiting Anna, Nathan discovered a sealed envelope taped to their back gate. Inside was a flyer, an invitation to a neighborhood gathering titled, "Community Conversation on Shared Aesthetic Values." The language was polite. The implication wasn't. The flyer noted that non-participating households would be discussed and that collective feedback from surrounding residents would shape the final recommendations. Karen's name wasn't on the document, but Nathan recognized the design. It mirrored the earlier brochure. Same font, same spacing, same quiet authoritarianism disguised as diplomacy. He didn't show the flyer to Melissa until she returned. When she read it, she sat in silence for a long time, then simply said, "They want to vote us out of a place we're not even a part of." Nathan nodded. They want to build a verdict, one piece at a time. They didn't attend the meeting. Instead, they submitted a formal statement through Jacobs, outlining the history of the harassment and stating their legal independence from any group that claimed to represent the neighborhood. The statement was read aloud during the meeting. According to a friend who attended, the reaction was split. Some rolled their eyes, others stayed silent. Karen reportedly called the statement a sign of unwillingness to engage with the spirit of community. The next morning, the lights on their back patio were shattered. 4 of the 6 Edison bulbs Melissa had installed with her hands had been popped, glass scattered like ice across the deck. No break-in, no theft, just a message. Nathan swept the glass slowly, methodically, every piece clicking against the broom like teeth. He didn't call the police. He didn't yell. He simply bagged the shards and added them to the file. But Melissa had reached her limit. That afternoon, she went to the city council building and requested a formal public record of all complaints filed against their address in the past 6 months. The clerk at the front desk hesitated, then quietly printed the forms without making eye contact. There were 7. 4 were anonymous. 3 had been filed under a generic resident account registered to the same postal box that had been used for the Enrichment Coalition flyers. The P.O. box belonged to a small legal office that handled HOA documentation for developments across the county. Karen's name was not listed, but the connection was obvious. That evening, while reviewing the records, Nathan noticed something else. Each complaint was filed within 24 hours of a visible improvement to their property: a new plant bed, a clean fence, a coat of paint. Every step forward had triggered retaliation. It wasn't the loungers, it wasn't the lights, it wasn't even about the property. It was about defiance. It was about the sin of autonomy. They were being punished for not asking permission. Melissa looked up from the stack of papers, her expression calm but sharper than he'd ever seen it. "She's not trying to win," she said. "She's trying to wear us down." Nathan met her gaze. "So we don't break." "No," Melissa said. "We build, we go further. We make this house everything it's supposed to be, and we let them watch." The night it happened, the air was unusually warm for early autumn, heavy with the kind of unsettled stillness that often preceded a storm. Nathan had just come in from securing the shed, where he'd been storing the new outdoor chairs Melissa had ordered, a sleek, solid set made of cedar. Unmistakably elegant but modest, with none of the artificial shine that Karen seemed to favor. Melissa was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, her movements slow and deliberate, as if her body had finally caught up to the months of psychological attrition that had weighed on them both. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards expanding in the warmth. It had become a ritual now, these moments of evening stillness before bed, not born of relaxation but of vigilance, each night closed like a chapter of a story neither of them had agreed to be characters in. It was past midnight when they heard the sound. Not loud, not violent, just the dry click of metal against glass. Then another. Then a third, quicker, sharper. Nathan was already halfway down the hallway before Melissa even rose from the couch. He stepped barefoot onto the porch and saw them immediately, shards of porcelain scattered across the bottom step, the remnants of flower pots that had lined the railing. They hadn't fallen, they had been thrown. One had hit the post light and shattered the bulb, leaving behind a sharp halo of broken filament. The others had smashed against the wood, leaving streaks of wet soil across the planks. No voices, no laughter, just darkness at the edge of the road, too far for his eyes to penetrate. He didn't shout, he didn't run. He stood still for a full minute, letting the silence stretch, watching for movement. Melissa joined him, arms crossed over her chest, not from cold but from the need to hold herself together. After a few minutes, Nathan turned back into the house and retrieved the spotlight he had mounted in the garage for emergencies. He swept it slowly across the yard. No one was there, but something glinted faintly at the base of the fence near the western border. He moved toward it, careful where he stepped. It was a nail strip 3 inches wide, welded metal teeth spaced evenly across a rusted bracket. Not carelessly thrown. Placed. He bagged it in silence. Melissa stood by the porch, watching, not asking questions. They both knew this wasn't random. This wasn't neighborhood mischief. This was escalation. The next morning they filed an incident report with the sheriff's department. The deputy who arrived took the information seriously, but his tone was neutral, professional to the point of detachment. He said all the right things, he would file it, pass it along, keep an eye on the area, but Nathan could tell from the man's eyes that he didn't expect anything to come of it. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no visible suspect. The deputy even asked, cautiously, whether they had any reason to believe someone might be unhappy with them. Nathan didn't laugh, though he wanted to. He simply handed over the folder, photographs, letters, timestamps, everything Jacobs had advised them to compile, and told the man to read. That evening Karen returned. She didn't come to the door. She didn't leave another flyer. She stood at the edge of their driveway, dressed in a navy windbreaker and clutching what appeared to be a clipboard under her arm. Nathan saw her from the kitchen window and walked out alone. He didn't ask what she wanted. He didn't say her name. She was the one who spoke first. "It's unfortunate that things have become so tense," she said, as if describing a weather system. "I had hoped for something more cooperative. But you've drawn a line, and now I'm simply responding." Nathan didn't move. "You're harassing us." Karen tilted her head slightly. "I'm responding," she repeated. "You've created division where there should be alignment. Do you know how many people are afraid to speak out because of what you represent?" He stared at her, unblinking. "What do I represent?" "Stubbornness," she said. "Chaos. Resistance to order." Nathan almost laughed, but there was nothing amusing in her tone. She truly believed it. This wasn't about lawns or loungers or lights. This was about ideology, about a worldview where uniformity equaled peace and variation was a threat. He had dealt with people like her before, not with clipboards and potlucks, but in boardrooms and contracting offices, in meetings where control passed hands without anyone raising their voice. Karen's power wasn't physical. It was systemic, relational. She didn't attack. She leveraged. "I'm not part of your system," Nathan said quietly. "And you don't get to decide how we live." Karen didn't respond immediately. She glanced toward the porch, where Melissa had stepped out, arms folded, the porch light behind her casting her in silhouette. Then she looked back at Nathan and said, "We'll see how long you feel that way when your insurance rates change. When the county begins evaluating storm impact across unregulated lots. When maintenance delays begin to affect your utilities." It wasn't a threat. It was a prediction. Nathan didn't answer. He watched as she turned and walked back down the street, her steps calm, composed, as if she had just completed a professional inspection. The next day, Jacobs called. She had received a notice that the Harpers' property was being added to a review list for potential fire zone impact assessment, something typically reserved for hillside areas with history of wildfire exposure. Their home didn't qualify. It was a manufactured process, a bureaucratic phantom designed to initiate a new cycle of inspections and requirements. More forms, more fees, more obstacles. That night, Nathan and Melissa sat in the backyard, the repaired porch lights glowing softly above them, the new cedar chairs placed exactly where they wanted them. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Melissa said, "I want her to know that we're not afraid, but I don't want to give her anything to use." Nathan nodded. "Then we keep building. We document everything. We don't bend. And when it's time, we take it public." Melissa looked at him, eyes steady. "With who?" "Not the papers," he said. "Not social media, not gossip." He gestured toward the binder. "With facts. With the people who still believe rules are supposed to protect the innocent, not just the powerful." The wind stirred gently through the trees. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Nathan didn't flinch. He had spent his whole life working with his hands, solving problems through precision and force. But this wasn't about force. It was about endurance, about knowing when not to break, and when to let the pressure pile so high it crushed itself under its own weight. Because Karen had made one mistake. She had mistaken silence for submission. And now the Harpers were done being quiet. By the time autumn fully settled over the lake, with the leaves curled into rust-colored spirals and the wind carrying a crisp finality through the trees, the Harpers had done more than endure, they had fortified. The loungers remained in place, unmoved, but everything else around the property had shifted subtly but unmistakably. The new fence posts were double-anchored, the exterior lighting upgraded and strategically positioned, and the binder that once held letters and flyers had grown into a full legal archive, cataloged, cross-referenced, and time-stamped. Their attorney, Jacobs, had escalated the situation formally, not with grand courtroom drama, but with a precise volley of legal notices and certified documentation that left no room for interpretation. She had submitted a formal complaint to the City Oversight Board and filed an injunction against further interference from the so-called coalition Karen had fronted, citing targeted harassment, malicious misrepresentation, and repeated misuse of civic channels for personal gain. The documentation, paired with witness testimony and the sheer volume of accumulated evidence, formed a case so airtight that it never reached a courtroom, not because it was dismissed, but because the other side folded. Within 3 weeks of the submission, the Enrichment Coalition dissolved quietly. Its website was taken down, the P.O. box closed, and Karen's name was removed from all remaining public-facing documents. No apology was issued, no explanation offered. It was not a scandal. It was a strategic retreat, an erosion of power disguised as irrelevance. Nathan and Melissa didn't celebrate. There was no moment of cathartic victory, no cinematic ending with champagne glasses or cheers from neighbors. The truth was simpler, heavier, and more satisfying. The interference stopped. The letters stopped. The inspections stopped. The flyers, the signs, the glances from across the street gone. Karen did not move. She remained in her house, curtains drawn, her walks less frequent, her smile rarer and thinner when offered at all. She didn't approach them again, nor did she retaliate. Whether it was fear of further legal action, or simple humiliation, they never knew. What mattered was that she now understood that the Harpers were not transient, that they would not be molded, coerced, or expelled, that the cost of pressing further would not be worth whatever fragile sense of order she believed she was defending. One afternoon, as Nathan replaced a section of the gutter that had weathered poorly through the last storm, a car pulled into their driveway. It was unmarked, a dark gray hybrid, clean but unassuming. Melissa stepped out to meet the driver, a city representative from the Office of Residential Affairs, sent to follow up on Jacob's complaint now that the coalition had been effectively dismantled. The woman was polite, efficient, and respectful. She confirmed that the Harpers' property had been improperly flagged in several internal systems, likely the result of manipulated reports. Those designations had been formally removed. Their name was cleared. Their file, the woman assured them, would remain permanently annotated to prevent future interference. Before leaving, she paused at the edge of the driveway and said, "Just between us, most people don't push back this far. They leave." Melissa smiled without warmth. That's probably why this happens so often. That evening, the Harpers sat on the back porch again, in the loungers that had started it all. The sky above the lake was lavender with dusk, the water still and reflective, the trees whispering their late-season secrets. There was no more tension in the silence, no weight waiting to fall. Only the hum of insects, the creak of wood, and the feeling of stillness earned through effort. Nathan glanced at the house, then at the street beyond the yard, and finally at Melissa, who had closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the wind. "I don't think she'll ever understand why we stayed," he said. "It wasn't just about the chairs, or the fence. It was the principle. The choice to live without fear of someone else's approval." Melissa opened her eyes and looked at him. "She doesn't need to understand," she said. "She just needs to remember not to try again." Weeks passed, then months. Life settled into a rhythm again. They reconnected with neighbors who had once kept their distance, some ashamed, others simply relieved that the shadow of collective compliance had lifted. A few quietly admitted that they had been uncomfortable with Karen's tactics all along but hadn't known how to speak out. Nathan didn't hold grudges. Melissa did, but she let them sit quietly in the background like stories too worn to rehash. In early spring, a new family moved into the vacant house 2 lots down, a young couple with twin boys and a Labrador that barked at everything. The Harpers brought over a tray of cookies and offered help with the trash schedule and water service setup. As they walked back up their driveway, the young mother smiled and said, "You've made this place feel more welcoming than we expected." Melissa paused, turned slightly, and said, "It wasn't always this way, but it is now." The loungers stayed on the lawn, season after season, sometimes used, sometimes not, but always there. Not as a symbol, not as a rebellion, but as a reminder to Nathan, to Melissa, and to anyone watching that no one had the right to decide how another person should belong. And that there was no shame in staying, no guilt in resisting, and no weakness in simply saying, "This is my home, and I will live on my terms." And so they did,